right? This is not
Yes.
comfortable for you. This is not what you would
No.
do in your spare time if you had a choice, correct?
No.
Welcome to the Carla Rand Show, a weekly podcast designed to dig into the lives of everyday people. People who are making a positive impact, people who have risen above and overcome obstacles. Insights and stories from ordinary individuals who inspire us all towards the truly extraordinary. Here's your host.
Hey, it's Carla, and today we're talking to Lise Pavich. And Lise owns Urban Image Spa in Edson here, and she reached out to me and she's like, we should collaborate. How can we talk? Like, what can we do? And she wanted to serve me. So she said, I'm going to give you a pedicure. She gave me my first pedicure and it was amazing. I was like, oh man, I feel like, some kind of a queen or something with this, pedicure for the first time. And she just did a lot of sweet things for me. She shared some of her story with me. We did a Facebook Live together, and she was able to talk, but she was not wanting to be vulnerable. She was like, Carla, I don't want to share all this stuff. I've had abuse, I've had neglect, I've had a lot of hurt in my life. I don't want to share it. But she told me, she's like, Carla, I want to start getting more vulnerable. Can you help me with that? And so I said, yes, I'll help you. So we kept talking, we had long conversations, and finally I was able to convince her to share her story because I think it will be really helpful for people. There's a lot of people that have had abuse, they've had neglect in their life, and for her to be able to share her story will help so many other people. So I hope that you'll enjoy this podcast and that you'll learn a lot. She gives us a lot of good tips and strategies for how to deal with people that are in the midst of it, or if you're in the midst of a situation with domestic abuse or anything like that. I hope that you'll get a lot of hope from this podcast and a lot of comfort and care as you hear her heart and how she's sharing. And one thing that she said that really impacted me, she said, Carla, I'm not a victim, I'm a survivor. So I hope you enjoy this, and let's get into the conversation. Welcome, Lise Pavich. I'm really happy to have you on the show. Thank you for being here.
Hi, Carla. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. I'm excited to talk to you, Lise, and I reached out to you a couple times. We actually did like a Facebook Live a while back, and we were talking about vulnerability, and that was kind of a challenge. Can you tell us a little bit, like, what was the challenging about being vulnerable? It's just not normal for you, hey?
No, that is not something that is comfortable in any way for me.
Yeah, and for years, I wasn't comfortable with it either. And it seems like more recently, I'm kind of learning that, hey, when I'm more vulnerable, I'm able to share more, which means I'm able to help more people. So that's kind of why I've been more vulnerable. But let's just kind of take it back a few steps here, and just give us an idea, Lise, what was your life like? Like, let's take you back to, say, junior high school. What was Lise like in junior high? How did you think? How did you feel? What were you up to? Where did you live? That kind of stuff.
Okay. Well, I was new to the community of Edson around that time in my life. So I went from Edmonton all the way to out near Piers. So completely culture shock beyond belief.
Yeah.
There was many, many more students where I went to school. So being different was normal. Whereas in Edson, I found that there was a lot more of groups, like I guess people used to call it like cliques of people, or, you had certain groups of maybe sports or things like that. And I was just getting used to the fact there was cows like on the property. So it was a very, very, very strange time. Not that I had never been there before, but it was just not in my backyard. Like, at all. In my backyard, there were sirens, there were, like it was busy and there was a lot of noise. So it was definitely very quiet. In terms of like how that was for school, I just kind of just did my own thing. I had my friends and I didn't really care what people thought of me. I just did my own thing.
It's kind of funny because I lived in Edmonton. Well, I grew up in Edson, and then I lived in Edmonton for school, and then I moved to Piers. So I kind of did the same thing, but I did it as an adult. And it wasn't the same culture shock because I was happier to be at Piers. It was what I was more comfortable with. But I could see going straight from the city right into a small, like, rural setting would be definitely an adjustment. Yeah. So, cool.
Yes.
So, did you play sports? What were kind of some of your hobbies and stuff? Did you have time for stuff like that, Lise, or was it just school?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I was the best student. I was probably a very distracted student. When I lived in Edmonton, I was very much a part of like outdoor sports and like band and like lots of arts and things like that. Whereas I don't even think I went to Vanier when I first moved here. And I think there may have been maybe a handful of people graduating that year. So that was very, very different. It was like all the way from kindergarten, play school, kindergarten, all the way to grade 12 when I
Mhm.
moved here. So everything, the groups were smaller. Like we had an art class, but not an art studio where you went to class. And there
Mhm.
was, I don't even think they had a music program at all at that
Right.
time. So
So you
the
were
arts part of me died
okay.
in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, why don't you tell us a little bit about like I know that you have in your life as you grew up, you have a lot of
Hmm.
history with like domestic abuse.
Hmm.
You had I want to I don't want to I want to basically say you had a very difficult not typical childhood. So can you just
No.
tell us a little bit, just sort of paint a picture for us so we can kind of see what was it like for you as a kid? What was it like? How was it
Mm.
different than probably kind of what the average person would be going through, certainly what I went through as a kid?
Right. So that's a really tough question for me.
Mhm.
Only not to share it, but just to understand what your childhood was not like what my childhood was like.
Mhm.
So when people ask me these things and I'm talking to them and they're looking scared and horrified about some of my like, oh, this is what we would do on family vacations. They're
Mhm.
like, what are you talking about? Like it sounds like a TV show or something very odd and strange.
Mhm.
Um, so I think a lot of the differences would be like my family unit, there was a lot of domestic violence, there was a lot of abuse, there was a lot of addiction issues. It was definitely like if I had to talk about things that were familiar, we had a lot of bikers as uncles and things like that. So it wasn't like I had little doll houses or things like that. Or if I did, I was probably that child that cut their heads off because I just was just that kid. I was a very odd child. And I
Mhm.
think that was developed a lot by me being alone a lot, or just maybe with my brother, or, hanging out with my dogs or something. Animals were a huge part of my childhood. But, when you're a kid and you live in that type of an environment, some of your needs just are not met. So things like, let's say I felt like sad or something, and I needed my mom, that need just didn't develop for me because my mom was always busy taking care of her stuff, or maybe some other thing was grabbing her attention. So I just learned very, very early on that those needs were not going to be met. My safety was my own responsibility. If it wasn't like I had like a mom to talk to about certain things in life, like it would be like having the most distracted parents you could possibly imagine. So there's no point standing there like screaming for help or looking for those kinds of needs to be met. And that started when I was very young.
So
And you just adapt.
what were your parents
Sorry?
doing? What were your parents doing then that they were so distracted and so not involved?
Well, I think that they, like when I was quite young, they partied a lot and they were involved. It would be like, and I don't think like they were teenagers at the time, but it would be like being raised by kind of just, I don't know, like wild and free spirits. They just
Mm.
did their own thing on their own time. My dad worked very hard to provide for his family, but I also don't believe that, you know, as much as he loved his family, it wasn't like the same loving as what maybe your dad would have been.
Mhm.
So those were very, very different. And it's hard to explain because you just, like, I always felt as a kid like I was in the way.
Mm.
I never ever wanted to go to my mom or to my dad and like ask for help because it was very unpredictable. So that was the other part of it too. Was I going to get yelled at? Was I going to, like, you just never knew. Maybe I would have gotten a hug that day, but there was never any like markers. Like, you see your mom's face and it's sad. Well, then she's sad and it's like predictable what you would do and what you could expect. That wasn't really the case for me.
Mm.
So, as an adult now, I can talk about that as being different or maybe adverse, or something that would be what I would think unhealthy,
Mhm.
because I've grown to learn that. But as a child, it was very confusing, very lonely, very isolating. And but still, I didn't feel like I was an unhappy child
Mhm.
either, because that's all I knew.
You don't know any different, so you just think of it.
Hmm.
So what are some, like, give us a picture of maybe some of the more extreme situations, just so we can kind of get an idea, if you don't
Okay.
mind.
Well, I don't mind. I don't know how my family would feel about it, but I also think that's the other part of this is that for me, I'm not a victim in this.
Hmm.
This is something I've survived. And a part of the survival aspect of it is that you are no longer a victim. You
Hmm.
heal. And all of these things, even though I'll talk about them, they're not who I am. They're things
Hmm.
that happened to me as a child.
Hmm.
And I also don't feel that somebody, as a parent of that type of child, purposely is just that way because they hate their kids or because of this or that. They've like wrapped themselves up into this lifestyle or an addiction or an unhealthy relationship, whether it's like violent, like physically violent, or like I was talking about, unpredictable. So, as like a small, tiny little, an example would be something like, um, I don't know, maybe there was a fight between my mom and my dad, and the next thing I know, like someone's head's going through the wall, or like it was fairly, like if I think about it, it would have been something like if I ever had a child in that, I would be horrified to know that a kid was even exposed to any of that stuff.
Hmm.
But for them, like, I don't know. I've never really talked to my parents about those kinds of things because a lot of the times they could have been high, they could have been drunk, they could have been like in their own little world of what was going on for them, not really thinking about the impact of for us kids.
Hmm.
So it was a really like kind of scary place to be where you were always walking on eggshells. You were always in this domestic violent cycle all the time. Like, is this the honeymoon phase? Like, how noisy can we be down here? Or does that mean like pardon my language, but shit's gonna hit the fan? Like, you just never
Hmm.
ever knew.
Hmm.
So I think that would be an example of, like, I remember my mom's head going through the wall and thinking like, we better grab the dogs and like we're gonna go play some kind of made up weird game downstairs. And I'd grab my brother and grab the dogs and we go and we would just be distracted by, we would create our own little world for ourselves to protect ourselves.
Hmm.
And that wasn't very clear to me until later on in life. Like, I had a best friend that I would spend a lot of time with her and her family, and we never talked about it. It
Hmm.
was not something that, like, I went to school and I cried a lot or people really knew. It was something that because I didn't want to be looked at differently because of my family, I just acted like I learned a lot from observation.
Hmm.
So kids would be laughing and kids would react this way. Well, I kind of like had no other sources of learning these things. So
Hmm.
a lot of the times I would feel like morphed into like different types of people because I didn't really know how to just be me.
Hmm.
So
So what are
I
some
don't
big
know.
what are some big obstacles that you've had to face? Like, you talked about some of them, but in your life, what are some of the bigger obstacles that have really been a problem, whether it's from your upbringing or whatever, that has
Hmm.
maybe, just been a challenge for you?
Well, I think a lot of that is a huge challenge,
Mhm.
and a lot of finding like being able to um being able, like, I think everybody kind of has this like inner guide, like this source that kind of is like maybe a right and a wrong, or maybe it's just like, I guess it would be also part of your self-esteem. So with that, you would just you would have an instinct of how to react to something.
Mhm.
Whereas for me, my instinct is always to double check it with like five different sources. So I would research things, I would look at stuff, I would maybe like ask friends about stuff. Like, and in grade 5, I put myself in counseling. I just felt like inside there was something not right. Like, I just needed an outside help to guide me through certain things.
Mhm.
So stuff like that could have been like making a decision about, oh gosh, like anything really. Like, I just was very uncertain about a lot of things.
Hmm.
Even though it didn't, like, let's say like you and I were friends in high school, you might tell me something and I would listen to you, but that didn't always mean that that's like how I guide myself, because I was also very stubborn. I was also very um like strong minded about certain things too. like I wouldn't let people in either. It was
Mm-hmm.
very difficult for me to be vulnerable about friends and like actually tell them the truth of um like I would just shut it off. I would just like go on my way because I'm not going backwards. I'm always going forward. So
Mm-hmm.
I would take a look at like the things in the past and try to understand them and learn them for myself and then move forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I don't
and
know if that answers anything that you
yeah, no,
just
that
asked
that
me,
that's
but
helpful. That's helpful. So I'm just thinking, like, some of the listeners right now, they're listening and they're thinking,
mhm.
wait, like, I have family or I have friends that are stuck in domestic abuse, whether it's,
Mhm.
with their husband or with their parents, or, a lot of grandparents take their kids out of a situation they're trying to raise these
Yeah.
kids. Like, is there any tips or advice that you would give to them, like on how they can maybe help the situation or speak life into those kids or anything like that?
Well, I think coming from those types of situations and being a mom myself,
Mm-hmm.
I think that sometimes these types of situations really knock on a lot of doors for us. So, like, I would say that for children, in a situation like that, like they really, really, really have to separate what's going on and who they are.
Mm,
Because what's going on around them doesn't identify who they are. And as a child, you don't have a choice of who your parents are.
mm-hmm.
You have to find those ways and those strengths and maybe a form of community or an outsourced aunt or uncle or cousin, or you have to find your happy places and things that are not so happy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, unfortunately, you disconnect in order to protect yourself, but being able to disconnect, you have to also be able to connect to the right people. And being that you haven't been given like this wonderful um, group of people to draw from, I think that it's really special when you have like best friends that actually engage with you and that are healthy. And like, I was never somebody that really liked drugs, or I would stay away from those types of things. Like, I would learn from my environment. So,
Mm-hmm.
for somebody who's in a domestic violence situation, I would say to them to never stop asking questions, never stop asking for help. And if somebody has something to say to you, don't kill the messenger. Like, don't shoot the messenger, because a lot of people do. They're like, no, that's not how he is. And I don't believe you. And you're just trying to hurt my relationship, or you just want my husband, or whatever, like, or girlfriend or boyfriend, or whatever the issue is. And I think that we already know what the answer is. We just don't want to admit it, because then again, now we have a life change. Change
Mm-hmm.
is like the worst feeling sometimes. It's unpredictable, just like, when I was talking about as a child. When you have things that are unpredictable and they're not comfortable, nobody likes to go there. So for
Mm-hmm.
me in my life, I've always pushed myself into uncomfortable zones. That's where I learn the most. That's where I'm free the most.
Mm-hmm.
That's when I'm like, I start to trust and believe in myself, that guidance that I have from myself. So I start to learn adversity. And that was something that came when I was really little. I'm very fortunate that that's the case. I wouldn't say that a lot of kids do that,
Mm-hmm.
because we become comfortable and we become traditional and we become what our environment is. For me, I didn't feel good about my environment. It didn't mean that I didn't love my mom or my dad or my family. I just didn't feel good about it. So I
Mm-hmm.
think like really understanding those feelings and like honoring them is really, really, really important.
Yeah, and I think
So
like the fact that you're here with me talking on a podcast is
yeah.
is a demonstration to everybody that you are willing to go in out of your comfort zone, right? This is not
Yes.
comfortable for you. This is not what you would
No.
do in your spare time if you had a choice, correct?
No. No. However, I mean, in the type of business that I do have, it's very personal. So
Yes.
all of the touches that I have, I feel that my business is all about the exchange. So you might come in and I might do a pedicure on you, which feels wonderful on your feet, but we've also had an exchange of who we are, and those are the things that matter the most to me.
Mm,
So in and amongst those small tiny exchanges, I feel that there's so much power behind that connection.
mm-hmm.
And those are like the tiny little things that I would say got me through all of everything when I was a kid. Maybe my uncle took me to like the corner store and he bought me bubble gum, but I got that one-on-one time with him and I felt special, and like whatever that felt like, was wonderful and it felt good. So that was our exchange. And I would have a lot of aunts and uncles that they would say to me, like, oh, I wish I could give you more. But all they wanted was love
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and security and to know like how to manage that relationship with that person. And that, I guess that was just, I was so lucky, so incredibly lucky. I had like 20 moms that would guide me, and I would have, however many like male role models. And like, I just, that might sound like a weakness in my life, that I don't have that one like pillar of strength or that one like rock or the anchor that holds me. But I have learned from so many different types of people, and I've got to pick and choose what feels good to me.
Mm.
So I think that that's something that's quite unique in the fact that I've absorbed all of those things and I'm that aware of those things.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I think a lot of people live a life, but they're not alive.
That's true. That's true. And like with your business, like you said, when people come, you want to be
Mhm.
connecting with them. Like that's important to you, that
Mhm.
connection and that kind of like,
Mhm.
I want to make you feel special for this time while you're
Mhm.
here, right? And that's why your
Mhm.
business is successful. And that's why people like to go to
Mhm.
you because they feel special just in that moment. It's more than just,
Mhm.
I'm getting my nails done or I'm getting my feet looked after, right?
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that's exactly it, Carla. I think that you have to live in the moment, like
Mm-hmm.
no matter what it is.
Mm-hmm.
I think on Mother's Day, I had talked to several different moms. They had kind of a rough Mother's Day, but if you broke it down into like the moments and you didn't focus on all the negativity that fell around it, but just those like core moments that you had full of love and experience with your children, no matter what that looked like.
Mm-hmm.
You could have been standing under an umbrella in the middle of a storm, but holding hands with your tiny child. Like
Mm-hmm.
to some people, that means everything to them. And
Mm-hmm.
those connections are important too.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that coming from an environment that's filled with all sorts of like it's loud and it's unpredictable and it can be really scary at times. It teaches you how to be an amazing, like you just notice every detail. I'm
Mm-hmm.
extremely detail orientated. It has benefited my job immensely. So
Mm-hmm.
when I look at it like that, I remember you and I were talking about some of these conversations and what they might look like, and I was like, no, I don't want to talk about it in a negative way. So I don't want negative words. I don't want like a negative feel around it. So to me, it just I allowed it to mold me into a very positive out. Um, what would you call that? Like it just I remember a counselor that I had used to tell me that we're a product of our environment. And I would get so mad at this person. I am not a product of my parents. I am nothing like them. I'm not like this. I'm not like that. I'm not any of these things.
Mm.
But really, I'm 100% a product of my environment. So I'm detail orientated. I'm like almost to a fault kind and like all these other things that I'm like pretty okay. Like if you came up to me and you had this like horrible thing to say, I would be like, "Oh, Carla, you just need my compassion today."
Yeah.
Like if people are like, "What is wrong with you?"
Mm.
So, but I think that the world needs to have those kinds of eyes. They
Mm-hmm.
need to have the eyes that can show compassion. However, with compassion, there also has to be um, a form of uh, accountability.
Mm.
Like if you're not accountable for what you're doing and what you're saying and how you feel about it, like I can own everything that I was as a child. I was a very strange child. I was a very like breaking all of the rules. Um, I just went against every grain you possibly would throw in front of me because I was testing everything. I
Mm.
never found the safety, so I would always test stuff. So if I couldn't say to you that I yelled and screamed at my parents, if I told you that I never snuck out of the house, like I would be completely lying.
Mm-hmm.
I tested every boundary, but I never felt bad about them so much. It was just me being rebellious or
Mm.
just being my little horrid self when I was a teenager because I just was searching. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that, as a kid, and I guess it would depend on each child, but there's a place in that life where you That's why you have your community or your family or people that love you, and you have those kinds of so that as a teenager, as a child growing, you really, 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 really learn how to make a mistake within that security and how to fix it. You have that guidance about
Mm.
what to do. Like maybe you're learning about money and you get a credit card that is like a pay as you go kind of a credit card. Well, then you learn within like those little boundaries. You don't go out and you don't get a $30,000 like line of credit and now you're bankrupt at like 25.
Mm-hmm.
So those kinds of things, I had to learn a lot of that on my own. I had to learn like a lot of that on my own.
And you're
I
the kind
moved
of
out when I
person.
was about,
Oh, sorry.
sorry, go
Sorry.
ahead.
I was just gonna say you're the kind of person that like you just figure stuff out.
Hmm.
Like I don't know
Yeah.
how to do it. I'm gonna figure it out.
Yeah. Well,
Sorry.
because that's the
Oh.
thing. I just don't have like that anchor or that rock or that somebody.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not, that also allows me not to be afraid either.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not afraid to try new things and I'm not afraid to go on a podcast and be vulnerable. I think sometimes it's a language thing. So, like what you would think as safety or security, what I would consider safe and secure might be completely different.
Mm-hmm.
So, that was one thing that I did find as I was growing up is that I always felt misunderstood.
Mm.
So, communication is extremely important to me. And a lot of my communication would be about, um, like maybe clarification or maybe like um, paraphrasing or something like that where I feel that you've understood what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that something like this, where it's a podcast and somebody might hear a part of it, they'd be like, oh, no, 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 that's not what it's like at all. Well, maybe for you, but this is my story and this is how it is for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you were gonna tell
Yeah.
us what you said when you moved out. How old were you when you moved
Mm.
out from home?
So I moved out kind of off and on when I was 16 years old. Um, I think the last straw again was a domestic violence situation in the home. And I think that, um, like, not to make excuses for like my parents' generation, but as you go back in generations, it was a little bit more accepted that you beat your wife and your children and like things like that. I'm not saying it's right by any means whatsoever. And I have my thoughts on what type of a person does things like that. But um, I think that um, I would consider my dad very old school in that he was the man, he did this. There was like that kind of dynamic in the house. Um, I don't know. When the domestic violence situation came to a head and it was starting to become an issue for myself and my brother, I chose that I just didn't want to be a part of that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So, I had lived with friends. Eventually, I lived with an aunt who took guardianship of me. That turned into like a huge nightmare. I had restraining order on my mom because I was like, when you're in a domestic violence situation as a child, you're also considered somewhat of a possession. So when you're a possession, you have to be there. Like there's this one track mind of like, she belongs to me. But there's also the abuse part of it where if you ever have somebody leave that home, they could become the most unsafe person in your world. They might speak the truth, like on a podcast. They might tell their friends. They might tell the counselor what really is actually happening. So the consequences of their actions, however they felt about it at the time, may become reality. So that again would be the accountability. So for
Mm-hmm.
somebody who has survived domestic violence, no matter if it's from as a child or an adult, I feel that in order to have forgiveness, there has to be reconciliation. And in this type of a situation, it's very rare that you get the accountability or that you get the reconciliation. Like it's very very small amount of people. So for the person who would be considered the victim or who was victimized, it's a long process of healing independently from your abuser. So if you thought about something like a plant, not that humans are plants, but if you thought about this tiny little plant that you're responsible for keeping life, You provide nutrients, you provide sunlight, you provide an environment that's free of like chemicals and pollution, and you watch it just bloom and grow. That was not the environment I grew in. So I might have a lot of like maybe my leaves were twisted or they have holes in them or like all these kinds of weird things that would have happened. So when I was in an environment that allowed those growths, I took full advantage of it as much as I possibly could.
Mm.
So I think that that would be a really good kind of way of explaining it, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
Like as a little tiny houseplant, like, you know,
It is. It's a
there's a
nice.
lot of things that spills over onto
Mm-hmm.
the things that are around us and we don't realize. Like I think children are like these little teeny tiny sponges that everything that you put in there, you input at one point or another will come back out at you.
Mm-hmm.
And these little eyes are viewing everything from everything that they have that's hardwired all the way down from those little tiny securities of when they cried and mom picked them up or someone held them or their needs were met. And that's how we develop as people. Like all of our needs create and mold us. So I think that we as adults are so attuned into so many different things like bills and, you know, where do we have to go today? What's on our schedule? What's going on here? That we don't pause. We don't breathe. We don't pause. And as we're sitting in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic, like I think that this is really like for me, it's been pretty like wonderful in a lot of ways that I have these coping skills. Whereas I see some of my friends struggling and I'm like, you're not going backwards. Like you're only going forward. Like you have all these tools that you had through your whole life. Like use them, be aware of them. Like
Mm-hmm.
you are a phenomenal person. Find your strengths and like learn to unlock them and allow them to be your voice or your strength. So where all of those times in my life where those would have like something would have knocked on my door or questioned those things, I have stood strong in who I was during that time. So whether that's a business thing or a personal relationship thing or as a mom, I had to learn how to be a mom almost in opposition of absolutely everything my mom did, but still trying to honor the snippets of love and the kindness that she had in her heart when she had time to be.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just interesting, I guess.
Yeah. And why is it so important to you, Lisa? I know you've mentioned this why is it so important to you to be seen as a survivor and not a victim?
Um, because even just when you say that,
Mm-hmm.
like if you say the word victim, how do you feel about it?
Yeah, you feel like everything's happening to you and you're sort of powerless.
Yeah, you're powerless. Like, but if you're a survivor, it's kind of like the situation is over there.
Mm.
It's not who you are. And
Mm-hmm.
you've through however what tools you've made it through or what concepts or theories or however you made it through, you made it through. You've survived it. Like I think when you look at it as a survival, you look back to it rather than being submerged in the middle of it.
Mm-hmm.
Where you're a victim, you're emotional, you're out of control. You have no idea like which way to go.
Mm-hmm.
You're lost almost in being a victim.
Mm-hmm.
Not saying that when you feel like a victim that you still don't have power and strength for yourself, but I just feel that I think when you become a survivor, you're also at a different healing point where you can definitely there's a strong boundary in place that says I have crossed over and no longer am vulnerable to the feelings or the impacts like it's separate from you.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah.
I talked a little bit about Mother's Day. So about 6 months ago in December, right before Christmas, my mom had attempted suicide. I have a very estranged relationship with my mom just due to the abuse and just because when um when I come around my mom, I was still victim to a lot of the situation. And you are a victim in the situation because um, there is no accountability and there is like, it's very difficult, like I said before, to forgive somebody without having reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
So if the person can't reconcile, like, the situation that you've been through with them, and they don't own it, what their part of it is, it's very, very hard to forgive, especially in a child-parent relationship. But even still, in a domestic violence situation as spouses, I would say that it's very difficult to say, "It's okay, like, that was all about you, it wasn't about me, that was your behavior, that was your stuff." So that's really difficult. So when my mom had come, and again, it was a domestic violence situation, it was old patterns, it was old pain, it was a whole bunch of everything that I could remember as a child. That's very much what got her to that point again.
Mm.
And I mean, I went and I picked her up from the Royal Alec Hospital 2 days before Christmas, and I just looked at this very shallow, um, woman who had aged that many more years, but was still a victim.
Mm.
She had no control. She was still lost, so incredibly lost for all the exact same reasons. Very different, but the same reasons. That was tough for me to accept that even still now, I had to caregive for my mother. When I was a child, I had to caregive for her. I had to look at her face and I had to understand sadness. I had to understand pain. I had to be be the parent in the situation. And I never wanted to be that ever again in my mom's life. It was not something that I was comfortable with. It wasn't something that I felt that I was honoring her. And as a woman, and as a mother, that is not ever something that I want to do for another person, is to carry them through something. I will walk beside you through anything, but just know that you're going to own your own crap, because I am not carrying your stuff. I will be there and I will listen, but it's not mine. It's like that was hers and she needed to deal with that. And it really, really, really showed me that at that point, it isn't mine. And a lot of the times, like, I talk about this actually with some of my friends. We talk about the word my. It's a 2-letter word that can really like sabotage a lot of relationships, especially in an abusive relationship. So when I talk about my mother, or I could talk about Louise, it really changes like the extension of myself and the extension of her. That boundary becomes like blurred. So it's tough, and there's a lot of people that have narcissistic parents or abusive parents, and a narcissistic person feeds their needs off of everybody else around them, whether it's emotional or it's they just who knows what it could be. That whole entire thing is like a whole nother podcast on its own. But
Yeah.
I think that like with my mom, I had to honor her for who she was, where she was at. I had to understand that it's her choice whether she wanted to, decide to go back or um I think the saddest part of it for me was that she had no idea the impact of how she got to where she was and how it impacted her children or her husband or the whole family. A few weeks after my mom had attempted suicide, my dad threatened suicide. And it was like I felt like I was like this little 6-year-old taking care of my brother again. And not that he's incapable of taking care of himself, but just the feelings and the thoughts and all of these kinds of things. I was like, I'm good, thanks. Like, this is my boundary. I will help you, but you need to make sure to attend like a mental health program, and you need to be on these medications. And like, if you don't follow my rules, I'm so sorry, but I am taking you back.
Yeah.
And because I feel like you can only help somebody and you can meet them where they're at, and that is about it. So for those people that need those types of words, they need to hear, this is you. And I've had friends, I've had family, I've had so many people that have said to me, I'm really sorry, like, I'm just not equipped to deal with this. Well, how do you think that felt? Like, I'm like, you're leaving me out, like, here to survive on my own? Like, what are you talking about? So sometimes that built strength. And I'm just lucky enough that like internal compass and that guidance was like very, very strong from the get-go.
Hmm. Yeah.
So resilience and finding, like completely finding those moments in my life where I paused and I took a breath. And, you know, I can't tell you how many times in my life that I've fallen to the floor, like crying from like the depths of my soul, not understanding this human race. Like I just don't get it
Mm,
sometimes. Where we could help, but we don't.
mm,
Or we do see things, but we keep walking by. It's just like, "Hi, Carla, how are you?" "Oh, I'm good." "Are
mm-hmm,
you really?" Like, I don't know.
mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
I think we all hide behind our own little walls sometimes.
Mm-hmm. And maybe that's a way that
Yeah.
we cope too, because if we start
Mhm.
saying how we actually are, we're like, ah, they don't have time for that. And sometimes maybe you
Yeah.
don't. When you see
No.
somebody in the grocery store and you're just like, hey, how's it going? Like, you're not going to be like, oh, like start bawling or something, right? Like,
Yeah.
you're probably just going to say, I'm
Well,
fine.
and so when you are in that place and somebody asks you, you're like, "Oh, please just really mean that you wanna know, because I just need to cry," or
Mm,
like those kinds of things. Like, I don't know. I don't know how other people feel about those sorts of things. I think that I do an amazing job of identifying that the situations that I've gone through are not who I am.
mm-hmm.
And I
Yeah.
think that's the difference between a victim and a survivor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Lise. I think we're gonna kind of wrap it up there. I love that you
Okay.
think of yourself as a survivor and not a victim. I always hate that victim mentality. I just feel like too many people, they live their life as a victim and they're not reaching their potential. They're not getting ahead in life. They're not
Mhm.
progressing because they're stuck in the past all the time. And I think seeing ourselves as survivor, just to flip that switch in our minds,
Mhm.
I think is going to be really powerful for people that are listening to this right now that maybe do feel like they are a victim, to be able to say, no,
Mhm.
I'm going to be a survivor. And also to the people that are stuck in domestic abuse, to be able to say, like, you need to keep, like you said, keep asking those questions, keep asking for help. Don't quit. Don't give up.
Mhm.
Get out of that situation and,
Mhm.
get the help that you need. So, Lise, if
For
somebody
sure.
wants to, just kind of, connect with you, learn about you. I mean, you have a spa that you do
Mhm.
pedicures, manicures, you do all kinds of stuff in the spa. Um,
Yeah.
where would they go to find you?
Well, you can always find me at Urban Oasis Spa Urban Oasis Spa. So we have a website. It's www.urbanimagespa.com.
Mm-hmm.
You can find me on Instagram. I have, I think, 3 on there. One's for Urban Image Spa. One's for myself as an educator for a nail company. And the other one is for just me personally. And that one, I share like all my pictures of my dogs and my cats and my child. That one you have to request to be on. But anything else, you can always find me on there. Yeah, pretty accessible. If you even just Google me, you will find me on there.
Lise Pavich at Urban Image Spa, something like that. Google
You
that.
could just put Lise Pavich, like you
Okay.
will find me. It'll
Okay.
come up on Facebook, Instagram, all sorts of things. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. Or
Awesome.
you could find Carla,
Yeah, you can
and
find me.
Carla will tell you.
I'll tell you where to find her. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Good. Well, thanks so much, Lise, for being vulnerable with us today and just sharing your
Yes.
story. I really hope that it helps a lot of people. So, yeah, I
Me
appreciate you.
too.
Appreciate you.
Mhm.
This episode is brought to you by my company, Power Fitness Online. We are a tight knit fitness community, and we guide you every step of the way to get fit and stay fit through our live workouts, nutrition coaching, and incredible support team. Go to powerfitnessedson.com to learn more. Thank you for tuning into the podcast today. If you enjoyed it, please leave a positive review on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Music, or wherever you're listening. And if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, I would love to see your comments. I would love to know what you think about this episode and interact with you. I love hearing from you. Once again, I'm Carla Rand, and this is The Carla Rand Show, and I can't wait to see you next week for our next episode.